Hi there, and welcome to this video about upgrading from JavaScript Object Model to the modern development techniques and PnPjs. Let me set the context. In the SharePoint add-in model, we were used to use the JSOM or JavaScript Object Model library to consume SharePoint Online data. And when doing that, we were able to consume either data in the app side of the application that we created with the SharePoint add-in model, or the host site data of the site that was hosting the SharePoint add-in that we created. And specifically, when we used to consume the SharePoint host data, it was a task that required quite an effort. In fact, we needed to rely on the sp.requestExecutor type and JavaScript library in order to being able to make cross-domain calls between the app site and the SharePoint host site, or from the provided hosted app to the SharePoint Online host site. Nowadays, with the modern development techniques that we have in SharePoint Framework, our life as developers is definitely easier than before. In fact, we have the ASP HTTP client object available out of the box in SharePoint Framework, and we can use it to easily consume SharePoint Online data. We also have the Microsoft Graph or MS Graph client object still available out of the box in SharePoint Framework, which allows us to easily consume Microsoft Graph from a SharePoint Framework component. And last but not least, the Microsoft 365 and Power Platform community provide us with the PnPjs library, which is a really powerful library built in TypeScript for TypeScript developers, which provides a fluent syntax to easily consume SharePoint and Microsoft Graph data from any client-side solution, including SharePoint Framework. What really makes a difference is that when you are in SharePoint Framework, you don't have anymore all the complexities of the app side, host side, cross-domain calls and stuff like that, because your code will be executed inside the page that is running SharePoint Online and is hosting your client-side modern solution. So let me move to the demo environment and let me show you how to rely on these new functionalities in SharePoint Framework. Imagine that you want to transform a solution built with the SharePoint add-in model and using the JavaScript object model of SharePoint into a SharePoint Framework modern solution using the new and modern development techniques. So let's start having a look at the existing solution. Like, for example, here we have a JavaScript file in which inside the SharePoint add-in model solution we retrieve the host web URL and the app web URL from the query string. We build the client context using the sp.clientContext get current object, and we build the host web context through the app context side, so that we can later on get from the host web the collection of lists and get a specific list by title, and we want to get the document library with the name documents. We make a query, camel query for all the items, and we get the items in that library. Once we've done that, with execute query async, we used to get the successful result and browsing through JavaScript through all of the items returned by the execution of the query asynchronously, or to provide an error message to the user in case of any failure. That was the development approach in the SharePoint add-in model with JavaScript SharePoint client object model. Now let's see how we should behave with SharePoint Framework. First of all, you should create a SharePoint Framework solution, and in order to do that, you can find detailed information in the article associated with this video. Here, we already have a SharePoint Framework solution with a couple of web parts. The first one relies on the SharePoint data using the SP HTTP client object provided out of the box by SharePoint Framework. So we have a very basic web part implemented in SharePoint Framework, which inherits from the base client-side web part. In the render method, we simply render inside the div with HTML only the content of a list of documents that we have in a library, as like we did in the SharePoint edit model solution. And in the onInit method of this web part, we invoke the getDocuments function, which internally relies on the context of SharePoint Framework and specifically on the SP HTTP client property of the context, which is a client for the SharePoint REST APIs. As such, we can make a get HTTP request targeting a specific URL, which will be the URL of the list that we want to query or the library that we want to query in the current site. And that's why we compose the URL of the HTTP request using the absolute URL of the web in which we are in the current page context of SharePoint Framework, followed by _API /web/lists get by title document /items, which is the URL, the syntax, the REST syntax to get the list of items in the document library with title documents using the SharePoint REST APIs. This SP HTTP client object and the get method of that object will make an HTTP get request and will give us back in the response asynchronously a JSON object which will represent the collection of documents, which is something that we use then to build our actual output. And in fact, here we get the list of documents as JSON, and then we parse them and we output them in the rendering of the web part. And if I switch to my browser, I can show you that here we have the list of documents in the actual document library, and using the workbench of SharePoint Framework, we can see the output of the web part that we have just seen, where this one is the general folder we saw before. Okay, so here I can get the list of documents using the SP HTTP client object. But we can do the same also using the Microsoft Graph client that we have out of the box in SharePoint Framework. This is yet another web part still built within the same SharePoint Framework solution. Here in the onInit method, we have a different implementation of the getDocuments function. The getDocuments here relies on this context still as before, but on the MS Graph client factory object, which will give us a client for Microsoft Graph. Then, through the client for Microsoft Graph that we get back from this method invocation, we can make an API query with a fluent syntax. So we make an API query for the collection of sites in Microsoft Graph, for the specific site in which we are based on the context of SharePoint Framework and of the page context. And then we get the children of the root folder of the drive, the default drive of that site. And in Microsoft Graph, the default drive is the documents document library. Then we make the get request, and the result will still be a JSON object with the list of documents that we are interested in. But in this scenario, we also have an interface, this ISP list items that we defined right here, which is made of an array of list items where every single item is made of a name and of an ID. So that when we do the output, we can simply bind that array of list items in the output of the web part. And again, we can check the result. So let me remove this one and let me add the other one. And here we can see still the list of items. And here we also have a good name for the general folder through the Microsoft Graph. So we can easily use native objects inside SharePoint Framework and through the context of SPFx to get access to the SharePoint REST API and to Microsoft Graph. But we can even do more. If we want to have a really modern approach to the development of our solutions, we can also rely on the PnPjs library provided by the Microsoft 365 and Power Platform community. So if we go to the browser first of all and we have a look, we can see that PnPjs is a library provided as an open source effort on the internet. And from here you can find all of the information you need to dig into the PnPjs library. Here we also have a solution, a SharePoint Framework solution, in which we have 3 different flavors about how to use PnPjs better and better. So let's start from the basics. If you want to use PnPjs, you have first of all to reference the PnPjs packages in your solution. And right here we have pnp at pnp/sp, at pnp/logging, at pnp/graph. These are the three modules that we are using in this sample solution. Then the very basic sample is a sample based on HTML as it was before with SPHTP client and graph. And here in the web part, in the onInit method, we still have the get documents, but now the get documents will rely on the factory interface of PnPjs for SharePoint, and using the context of SharePoint Framework, we get back an SP object, which we can use with a Fluent API to say, from this SP object, give me the web in which I am, give me the collection of lists, give me a specific list with title documents, and give me the items. As you can see, this syntax is way better than working at low level with the URL of the REST request or with the URL of the graph request. And at the very end, we will still get back an array of list items, the items, and so the documents in the document library, and we can render them in the output. However, this is a very basic one where we simply work with HTML at low level. What if you want to use a React component in your web part? Well, here we have another example. In this one, we still work with PnPjs, but in the render method of our web part, we rely on a React component. So, first of all, in the component did mount of the React component, we load, still using PnPjs, the list of items in the document library called documents in the current web. But in order to have this object inside our React component, we need first of all in the web part to provide in the render method of the web part that SharePoint object to the React component. And this ._sp is nothing more than, one more time as before, the creation of a SharePoint object with the PnPjs using the context of our SharePoint Framework solution and using the SharePoint factory initializer of PnPjs. However, what if you have multiple React components in your solution, or if you have nested React components? You would have to provide the SP object in the properties of all of the React components that you are using, and you will have to build a chain of properties with this SP object, which is not always that convenient, and it is also quite complex from a testability point of view. That's why I'm going to show you a third option, which is, I would say, the best one, in which we still have a web part built with SharePoint Framework. In this web part, we render a React component, but as you can see, we do not provide any custom and complex object of PnPjs. But actually, in the onInit method of this React-based web part, we have this getSP method providing the context of SharePoint Framework. This getSP method, which is imported from a PnPjs config file, is actually a function that will simply use the context, if provided, if any, to build right here the context object of PnPjs and to store it in a variable which will become handy and available to all of the other instances of components that will need it. As such, for example, in the React component we have in this solution, in order to get a reference to the SP object, we can simply say again getSP without providing the context, and this function will try to get the SharePoint object from PnPjs if it is already existing, and will use it inside its own implementation. That's what we are doing right here. So rather than providing the PnPjs object to the React component through a property, we just rely on a function which will be an initializer of the PnPjs object that we can share across multiple components. And then the syntax is exactly the same as before. So we use the SP object, we use the Fluent API to access the web, the collection of lists, and so on and so forth. And then we do the actual rendering of the list. So we can run this solution as well and see the output just for the sake of completeness. So let me run gulp serve for this web part, and it will take a while to build and make it available, and then we can play with it. So let me run it. And here it is ready. So we can go back to our workbench, and here we can say that we want to remove this one. We refresh the page to get the new manifest, and we want to add our web part. So the minimal one, still showing all of the items, is the one that simply creates the PnPjs on the fly. Then we have the one with the React component, which will rely on the PnPjs object provided as a property to the React component. And then we have the third one with the initialization function, which can be shared across multiple React components. Here you can find additional links if you want to dig into the topics that we covered. And like always, thank you for watching this video.